وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم ومن آياته أن خلق لكم من أنفسكم أزواجا لتسكنوا إليها وجعل بينكم مودة ورحمة. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that from among my signs I have created from yourselves spouses or mates that you may dwell in tranquility with them and put between you mawadda and rahmah, love or affection and mercy. Now we read this ayah, you may read this ayah many times, you see this oftentimes on wedding announcements. But the question is, how many of us are actually able to implement this, or how many of us actualize this in our relationships? Allah here is describing a relationship that is built on love and mercy, and a relationship that brings about tranquility. So we know this ayah, but the question is, why do we not find this in our relationships? And while I think there are a lot of answers to this question, it's a complicated question, relationships are never simple. But there's one formula which has been found when it comes to men and women and the interaction between them. And this formula can basically be boiled down to what a man's primary need is and what a woman's primary need is. Now this is in general, this is not all men and not all women, but what they have found is that for a man, his primary need is to feel respected. And for a woman, her primary need is to feel loved. And when you look at, and what they argue, is that when you look at the anatomy of any argument between a man and a woman, in any type of relationship, either the marital relationship, even in working relationships, relationship between siblings, working in the MSA, whatever it is, that when you break down any conflict that happens between men and women, you can break it down to this. A man has felt disrespected, and a woman has felt unloved. And what happens is the two then make the other one, or rather worsen the other one. So when a man, for example, maybe a woman feels unloved by something that the man has done. So I'm going to give you guys a scenario to explain this relationship. Now this will happen in a lot of different types of relationships. You might be working in the MSA, a guy says something and you get offended by it. A sister gets offended by something that a brother said. Or a wife gets offended by something that the husband said. Or a sister gets offended by something that her brother said. Now when that happens, the girl, the woman, feels unloved because he just said something offensive, something that hurt her feelings. As a result of her feeling unloved, how does she normally react? Well, usually, oftentimes, the knee-jerk reaction is to be sort of, you know, you kind of have an attitude. You know, like you see that somebody said something offensive about women, or somebody said something offensive that you took and offended you. So oftentimes women will respond kind of like they'll snap. You know what I'm saying? We'll snap. And that snapping is kind of like the show attitude. But how is that then interpreted by the male, by the man? That's interpreted as being disrespectful. So then what happens is, now the man feels disrespected, and so he responds with what? Being even more unloving, even more harsh. And the more he's harsh, and the more he's being unloving, the more she's being disrespectful. Because see, you're hurting my feelings. But see, you don't say it like that. So what happens is the woman doesn't say, you know, you're hurting my feelings. She instead says, well, you don't know anything, or you're so this, or, you know, her response tends to be something of disrespect. But what's really at the root and the heart of it is she just felt unloved. But the problem is that she's responding with disrespect. And what that does is it triggers a man. In any basically more, hurtful. So this is what they call, these relationship experts call something they call the crazy cycle. It's called the crazy cycle because it's so hard to break out of. The man feels disrespected, he responds with being unloving. The woman feels unloved, she responds with being disrespected. You can see how this becomes a vicious cycle, where one is actually feeding into the other. So the question now, how do relationship experts talk about breaking out of this cycle? They talk about two concepts. One for the woman and one for the man. Now the concept for men that's being told to the men is something called unconditional love. Now women in general can understand this concept. It's natural for a woman to love unconditionally. It's something that we naturally can understand this idea in general. Unconditional love means no matter what you do, we get angry at our children, we're displeased, but we still love them. That's unconditional love. So what they advise is that a man should show unconditional love to the wife, meaning even if she's doing something that's disrespectful, he still responds in a kind way. He still responds in a loving way. And what that will do is it will trigger the woman to be more respectful. And vice versa. Now here's the concept that women are told to do. And this is a concept which is a bit foreign to women, and that's something called unconditional respect. The reason I say it's foreign is a woman can understand unconditional love, but it's very difficult for you to convince a woman of this concept of unconditional respect. Because in a woman's eyes, you gotta earn my respect, right? You have to do X, Y, Z before I'll respect you. But that's very similar to saying you gotta do X, Y, Z before I'm gonna love you. We would never say that. But it's the same, it's very similar. And for a man to tell him you have to do X, Y, Z first before I'll respect you, that's very hurtful to a man. Unconditional respect means that regardless of what the situation is, you always respond in a respectful way. It's not that you only respect him when he's being nice. But respect, and again, respect is not the same thing as he's telling you to do something unjust or he's telling you to do something wrong and you obey. But respect is something different. You can not do something but in a respectful way. Someone could be telling you, take off your hijab. You can still keep your hijab on in a respectful way. It doesn't have to be disrespectful. Even when the man, who was dealing with one of the companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, he was dealing with a non-Muslim mother. She was a disbeliever. And even the way he spoke to her, when she wanted him to go back on his Islam. Now imagine someone is telling you to go back on your Islam. And yet, the way he responded was kind of a little bit harsh. She said something like, she basically threatened him that if you don't go back on your Islam, I'm gonna starve myself, I'm gonna end up killing myself, or something of that sort. And his response was, even if your soul left, you had so many souls, and each one left one by one, I would never leave this religion. He was actually told not to speak to her in that way. Even though she's telling him to go back on his Islam. Now, obviously, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger would never want him to go back on his Islam. But even in the way that he spoke to her, in response to someone telling you to commit kufr, still he's told to have respect for his mother. So we can have respect without necessarily doing something which is wrong. Respect is a different issue. So when you read this advice that relationship experts give, I decided that I wanted to go back and let's look at the Quran, let's look at the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and see what was the advice given by the Prophet ﷺ when he was advising men and women. And what I found was that it was very similar to this. When the Prophet ﷺ advised women, he didn't advise them to love their husbands. He didn't usually, he didn't say, be very loving, take care, be kind. But a lot of the emphasis was to be respectful. It was very emphasis on obedience, respect. It was in the category of respect. So there's this woman, and she was worried about her husband. You'll see it. A woman, she's worried about her husband's health. So they have a rule in the house, there's no soda, or you guys call it pop, right? No carbonated drink, whatever you want to call it, in the house. So what happened was he had to sneak it in, because there's this rule, right? He's an adult. He had to sneak it in and kind of drink it in secret. It's soda, right? It's not beer, it's soda. And so what happened was, she found one of the soda cans or something hidden. So what she did was she took it and she dumped it into the sink and then put the empty can back or something like that. So when he went to go drink it, it was empty. You guys see what I'm saying? So what she's done right now, she's done out of love, but she's treated him like a child. She's just treated him like a child. Like, she's going to impose on him when he drinks and when he doesn't drink. You guys understand? So what happens is, the woman loves her husband here. But do you think he's happy with what just happened? No. In fact, he's extremely upset by what just happened because you disrespected me. You're treating me like a child. And this is something which women sometimes tend to do. That you love your husbands, you love these men in your life, even your sons. But what ends up happening is you baby them as a result. You might sort of smother them. And what that ends up doing is the man feels disrespected because you're his wife, not his mother. So this is a lesson, again, the concept of respect is something that we don't necessarily have or we don't necessarily understand. And that's extremely important because that's the most important need that a man has. And the majority of men, and this is what they found, if you were to ask a man, if you had a choice between nobody respecting you or nobody loving you, which would you choose? And women and men answer this question differently. If a man is asked, the majority of men, if you ask them, would you rather have no one love you or no one respect you, they would choose have no one love me. They would rather be respected. If they had to choose between love and respect, they choose respect. And for a woman, when asked this question, the majority of women would say, I would rather be loved. Respect, and obviously the two are related. But the idea here is we want to feel loved and cared for. And that's a very, very strong need for women. And so for women, what we end up doing is treating men in the way that we would want to be treated, and that's not necessarily the way that they want to be treated. So it's important that women understand what's the need of the other person. So here the Prophet ﷺ is advising women again and again, obey your husbands, respect your husbands. What then does the Prophet ﷺ advise men when he advises men about women? The advice given to men is very much about be kind to women, take care of women. So it's very much in the department of love. Be loving, be kind, be caring. Do nice things for them. The type of example that he had was just that. That he was very caring and very loving to his wives. And actually one of the most, I think, beautiful examples of this exact lesson. Remember we said that the solution to break out of this crazy cycle was unconditional love and unconditional respect. So let's look at the example of the Prophet ﷺ and his companions. When 𝐁𝐎𝐿𝐒 was jealous of one of the other women, one of the other wives, she actually, out of jealousy, she broke a bowl because she was jealous of what the other wife had done. And when you look at the example of how the Prophet ﷺ responded in that example, a lot of men would consider this disrespectful. You're basically making a scene and you're acting, sort of out of control. I mean, some men would see it that way. And you're doing something out of anger, out of jealousy, and they would probably, most men would be pretty harsh. But look at how the Prophet ﷺ responded. He just looked at because there were people there. He said, your mother is jealous. First of all, the way he addresses her with so much, love and care and respect. And he was so kind with her. He didn't reprimand her right then. He didn't get mad at her, didn't yell at her. He said, your mother is jealous. First of all, he understood what she was feeling, and he was kind and he was soft. Even though she wasn't acting, in the ideal way. You see that unconditional aspect? And then you look on the other hand, unconditional kindness from another example, unconditional love. The example of Umar. During the time of Umar, there was a man who came, during the Khalifa of Umar, there was a man who was going to Umar to complain about his wife. And he was going to complain, and when he got to Umar, he heard Umar's wife, raising her voice at Umar. So then he turned to go back. And when Umar came out and asked him what he had come for, he said, well, I came to complain about the same problem you have. So he was going to go back. And you know what Umar said? Now before I say what he said, just think about who is this? Who is Umar? First of all, when you think of a strong man, usually you think of Umar. He was the epitome of a strong man. And yeah, look what he says. He says that my wife, she takes care of me. She takes care of my kids. All of these things that my wife does for me, can I not be tolerant when she raises her voice? So what is happening here? She's obviously in the wrong. She's being disrespectful. But look at his response. His response is still one of kindness. This is unconditional love, where he's still being loving, he's still being kind, even when she's being disrespectful. Now, again, it goes the other way. If a man is being unkind, a lot of times women think, or a man is being unloving, a lot of times women think, well, I'm going to demand my right? So the response to the man being harsh, or maybe hurting her feelings, is, okay, well, I'm going to respond harshly as well, and I'm going to demand my right, and I'm going to, and almost what ends up happening is you start being insulting or disrespectful or put the man down. Well, actually what that does is only makes things worse. But if you actually respond with respect, what that does is it actually turns and it ends up making a man more loving. When a man has his primary need fulfilled of being respected, he responds with love. And when a woman has her primary need fulfilled of being loved, she responds with respect. But everyone sometimes falters, right? We're not always respectful, we're not always loving. So that's why the way to break out of the cycle is, even when the other person is making a mistake, you continue to be respectful and loving. One other aspect of the idea of men and women and what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman in the relationship aspect of it, I want to just touch upon before I open up for questions, is the definition of manhood and the definition of womanhood. I want to talk especially about the definition of manhood, and we sort of touched upon it a little bit with the story of Umar radiallahu anhu. That Umar radiallahu anhu was known to be one of the strongest companions. And yet Umar radiallahu anhu, look what he's able to do when he's being provoked. He's able to control his anger. Now let me tell you this. So basically nowadays the way we raise boys is that a boy is taught from very early on that no matter what he feels, it's not really acceptable to show emotion, especially not crying, especially not being too sensitive. And so what a boy has to do, or what boys and men are taught growing up, is that it's not acceptable to show any emotion except one. There's only one emotion that it's acceptable to show and still be manly. What's that emotion? Anger. Exactly. Now let's look at that. Let's look at that for a second. So the idea is you're weak if you show any other emotion. So you're weak if you cry, but you're strong if you show anger. That's what society says. Am I right? Now let's look at the definition of the Prophet ﷺ. Exact opposite. Exact opposite. When the Prophet ﷺ asked his companions, who is the strong person? They responded, they said, the one who can wrestle well. And he said, no, the strong person is the one who can control himself in the fit of anger. So look at the definition of the Prophet ﷺ. In fact, it is weakness to not control your anger. It's not strength. According to the definition of the Prophet ﷺ, that's not a sign of strength, that's a sign of weakness. The strong one is the one who can control his anger in the same way that Umar Radwan did in that example. Now look at what is considered weakness. Crying, for example. Showing affection, for example. When you look at the definition of what it means to be a man in our society, one of the most common definitions today is this lack of emotional expressiveness. And it's almost universally believed that it's unmanly and weak to cry. And yet the Prophet ﷺ described it very differently. When the Prophet ﷺ was handed his daughter's son who was dying, his eyes flooded with tears. His companion Sa'd told him, "What is this, O Prophet of Allah?" And he ﷺ said, "This is a mercy that the Almighty has made in the hearts of his servants. And surely Allah has mercy to the merciful ones among his servants." In this example, the companions at that time thought it's kind of similar to what we do now. They saw him crying, and they thought, what is this? To them, crying was a sign of weakness. And he explained it differently. He said that this is actually a sign of mercy. It's actually a mercy that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put in the hearts. And that Allah is merciful to the ones who are merciful to the creation. But today, a man is not only expected to hide his sadness, he's taught early on that every other emotion is not to be expressed. So even affection. During the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there were some men who believed the same way. Once, while a villager was present, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ kissed his grandsons on the forehead. At that time, the villager said with surprise, look at what the villager said. And he's saying this out of, he's kind of boasting. And what's he boasting about? He's boasting by saying, I have 10 children, and I have never kissed any of them. That's what he was boasting about. Prophet Muhammad ﷺ responded in such a beautiful way. He said, he who does not have mercy will not have mercy upon him. In fact, with regards to showing affection, the Prophet ﷺ was very clear. He said that if a man loves his brother in faith, he should tell him that he loves him. So look at, subhanAllah, the Prophet ﷺ's response to a man who thought that it was manly, more manly. He made him more of a man that he had 10 children and never kissed them. That was his idea of being a man. And yet the Prophet ﷺ said, this isn't what it means to be a man. This means that there is a mercy there. The one who does not have mercy on the people will not have mercy shown to him. The Prophet ﷺ used to show a great deal of affection towards his wives as well. Aisha reported that the Prophet ﷺ would enjoy his meals when she would sit next to him. They would drink from one cup, and he would watch where Aisha would place her lips on the cup so that he could place his lips in the exact position. He would eat from a bone after she ate from it and place his mouth where she had eaten. So you see the way he would show affection to his wives, not only to his children, his grandchildren, but also to his wives. Now what's another thing that's considered unmanly? Well, one other thing that's considered unmanly is helping around the house, right? What do you mean help around the house? That the idea is that's an unmanly thing to do. And yet the Prophet ﷺ used to help around the house. And Aisha reported, and this is a hadith that's narrated by both Bukhari and Muslim, that the Prophet ﷺ used to stitch his clothes, milk the goats, and help in the chores inside the house. Can you believe that? And subhanAllah, what's really interesting is we talk a lot about following the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. But don't we pick and choose which sunnah we like, which sunnah we don't, right? This is the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Yes, he used to help out. And when the time for salah came, he would go and pray. So he didn't, of course, it didn't take him away from the remembrance of Allah. It didn't take him away from his mission and his job. But this is what he did. This was his beautiful example. But perhaps one of the most common myths of what a man should be is the idea of a man being tough. Gentlemen sign of weakness. And yet the Prophet ﷺ said in a hadith, Allah is gentle and loves gentleness. He gives for gentleness what He does not give for harshness, nor for any other thing. And that's narrated by Muslim. In another hadith he says, he who is deprived of gentleness is deprived of good. He who is deprived of gentleness is deprived of good. And yet so much of that gentleness has been lost from our modern definition of masculinity. So really what we really have to do as a community, both men and women, we have to go back to the Islamic definitions. When it comes to being a woman, unfortunately, we talked about society's definition for men and how that definition contradicts so much of the prophetic definition of manhood and the prophetic definition of strength. And for women, unfortunately, society also has definitions which are completely contrary. One of the definitions for what makes you, a woman is the fact that you can be seductive, the fact that you can attract men, the fact that you be considered pretty, pretty, beautiful, thin, and attractive to men. And subhanAllah, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the honor of a human being, it has nothing to do with the way you look. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about honor, He says, إِنَّ أَكْرَمَكُمْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ أَتْقَاكُمْ, that the most honored of you to Allah is the one who has the most taqwa, the one who is most righteous, the one who has the most fear and God, the fear and consciousness of God. But we have to relearn, we have to unlearn and relearn the definition of what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a man, and how to have this successful relationship. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم إنه غفور رحيم. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. So I have a few minutes for questions, thoughts, reflections. Usually this is a topic that people would rather write their questions down, am I right? Yes. What was the first part of your question? How do we okay, so she's saying how can we reconstruct the way in which the definition of man and womanhood is given by society? I think we need to return to the Sunnah. I mean, we need to go back and study. One of the problems is that we blindly accept things from society. We blindly accept definitions from our tradition. We blindly accept norms from our culture. And we don't go back and actually learn the true definitions as given by Allah and His Messenger. We also like to pick and choose the things which are convenient for us, the things that go along with our own hawa, the things that go along with our own inclinations, and what we're used to. So we're not used to helping around in the house. It wasn't considered manly. Some men, they tried to help out and their mom was like, what are you doing? You can't do any dishes. That's a woman's job. Some men are raised in that way. So it becomes difficult for them to then look at the example of the Prophet and be comfortable with it. So we have to unlearn, we have to not blindly accept the definitions given to us, handed to us by society and by our culture, but rather return to the Sunnah and study what the Prophet gave us. One question. Is there any paper?
Yeah, I passed it on.
You did? Okay.
Yeah.
Are there any questions that people want to bring forward? Just pass it to the end, and then someone can collect. Okay, this is a very good question. Would you suggest any books to educate Muslim women about respect? Honestly, there's a really good book. It's called Love and Respect. It's written actually by a Christian pastor, interestingly enough. And yet the section on respect, it's called Love and Respect, and the author is named, his last name is 𝐁𝐻𝐿, something of that sort. I can look up the spelling. But it's a book which basically it talks about the crazy cycle, why men and women get into these cycles of argumentation, where it's about the love and respect, the woman not feeling loved, the man not feeling respected. And then he has 6 chapters, I think 5 or 6 chapters directed for men about women, how to be loving to women, and then 5 or 6 chapters directed towards women about men, how to be respectful. And I have to say, out of the 2 sections, the one directed to women about how to respect a man is like right on. I mean, if you were to give that book to a guy and say, hey, what do you think about this? He'd be like, right on. I mean, it's really very, I think that's very good advice. And he basically talks about like 5 or 6 different aspects of what a man needs in terms of how to show him respect. And it's interesting because, subhanAllah, it's a slam in the sense of the role of the man in the relationship. There's like a part about him needing to provide, him needing to lead. Like things about basically the role of the man as being the provider, the leader, and the protector. That's actually in there. So I would recommend that book in terms of respect specifically. It's also good for men to read about. It's for both.
Another question?
Any other questions? So I had the spelling of the book if you want to write it down. The author's name, Dr. Emerson Eggerichs. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but Emerson is E-M-E-R-S-O-N, and the last name is E-G-G-E-R-I-C-H-S. And the title is Love and Respect, the love she most desires, the respect he desperately needs. The other question is actually a fiqhi question, which I can't touch, but it has to do with different options if you can't have children. That would be something definitely I would recommend talking to a sheikh about. Any other questions? Yes.
What can we do in our community to overcome these barriers? Because more and more women are providing, and so the men probably should help a lot. And they don't. It's very hard to relearn.
It's really hard
to relearn.
Yes, it is.
It's probably easier to teach the children in these schools.
Yeah. I actually agree with you. I think it is hard to relearn, to unlearn, and it's very hard to unlearn, and then to relearn. We can try to have programs like this, where we educate the community. Just educate them about the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. We don't need to talk about anything outside of the Sunnah. This is how the Prophet ﷺ treated his wives. This is how the Prophet ﷺ acted in his home. Do we not want to follow the Sunnah? And that's the thing, is we claim to want to follow the Sunnah, but when there's a Sunnah that I don't like, then I don't really want that. And that kind of shows a lack of sincerity. It's kind of what you pick and choose. You're doing, they talk about fatwa shopping, it's like Sunnah shopping. Right? You just want to, pick the Sunnah that you like. But this is how the Prophet ﷺ was. And I agree with you, we have to really emphasize in how we're teaching our children. Because it is harder to unlearn, it's much easier to teach it in the right way to begin with. That it doesn't make you unmanly if you are, gentle, expressive, that you need to control your anger. It's not okay to just explode every time you feel something. It shows in the form of anger. That's actually against the advice of the Prophet ﷺ, who told us to control our anger. And really the way it ends up happening is that every emotion, because men are They have feelings. But what happens is whatever they feel can only be channeled in anger, because that's the only acceptable expression that they've been taught, in a sense. So if they feel hurt, it comes out as anger. They feel sad, it comes out as anger. They feel afraid, it comes out as anger. So you basically see them angry a lot of the time. It's not because it's not all anger. It's a lot of different emotions which are always kind of coming out as anger, because that's, you can't cry, you can't complain, you can't, so there's no really other outlet. So it ends up, unfortunately, being coming out in that way. How do you teach respect for those who don't know it? And I think, again, it comes back to following the sunnah. For women, just like men, to follow the sunnah, we also have to follow the sunnah and the advice of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. When we really love the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and really love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we're going to take his advice seriously. And when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam says to respect, husbands, to respect your husband, to listen to your husband, you will be able to do it, and you don't feel, humiliated, but rather you do it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that I'm showing this respect for his sake. But let me just emphasize that showing respect is not the same thing as allowing yourself to be abused. It's not the same thing as allowing yourself to be oppressed. Those are two different things. So as believers, we should not ever allow anyone to oppress us. We should not allow someone to abuse us. But at the same time, again, that's different than being respectful. If someone is not, so the issue of abusive situations, oppressive situations is a completely different category. I'm talking about a situation where there's no abuse, there's no oppression, but it's normal interaction between men and women. You guys understand what I'm saying? That in that case, we have to try our utmost best to be respectful for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and out of love of the Prophet and his advice, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Do you have any book, website for young boys, how to control their anger, any solution? Honestly, I was actually thinking about this. I feel like, because once you get older, when a boy grows up or a girl grows up, it's a lot harder to learn how to control your anger once you're older. I feel like we should teach our children anger management. I honestly feel like we need to have anger management training for our children so that they learn healthy ways to channel their anger. Because anger is a normal human emotion. And in fact, it is a healthy human emotion if it's channeled in the right way. It was put in us for a reason. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not make any mistake. But we have to use it in the right way. And one of the reasons why anger was put, ironically, look at this. One of the reasons why we were given anger is to make us use it and channel it to protect the weak. To protect the weak against the oppressor. But instead, what we do, we use the anger to oppress them. We use it the other way around. We use that anger to basically dominate ourselves, to take over, to oppress. And it's not supposed to be for that. That's an abuse of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us anger for. We're supposed to get angry when we see someone else being abused. We're supposed to get angry when we see oppression, in Syria and Palestine. That's supposed to make us angry and therefore act to alleviate that oppression, to help those weak people, to help the weak. But instead, we abuse it and we end up becoming oppressors. So I think we have to teach this skill. I believe that we have to teach our children this skill. And I think that we should have training for this. There's classes for anger management, but it just becomes much harder once you're an adult. I wonder, it's like this idea that nobody's been doing, but I wonder if we taught our children this skill, how much it would change their life growing up. Once they become adults, to actually know how to control their anger. I just feel like it would change the world. How much damage we do just out of anger, and how much damage we do to our own selves. Yes.
I have two questions. Is there any book or literature, Islamic literature, you would recommend on this subject? One. Second, you mentioned anger management. is there any anger management workshop conducted by the Islamic Muslim professionals that you would recommend to our community?
That would be wonderful. I don't know. Oh, so his question was, the first one, were you asking for a book or?
Book or Islamic literature on this subject.
Okay, Islamic literature on the subject. That was the first question. The second one was anger management that combined Islamic, like concepts in it. I don't know of one that has anger. The second question, I don't know of something like that. But that would be something wonderful to do. I mean, I think it's very needed. There is actually a lot of classical work done about anger. For example, 𝐁𝐎𝐻𝐿, he has a whole section in his book, in his work about anger, the cause of anger, how to control anger, how to, just how to go about it, why do we get angry, and I think it's something that's needed, very much needed. In terms of like relationship question about from an Islamic point of view, I think the more that we read about the Sunnah, we read about the way that every time we read a story about how the Prophet ﷺ dealt with his wives, in it is priceless advice of how to be in a relationship, what to do in this situation. Because, mashallah, he went through every role that we could be in, right? He was a leader, he was a husband, he was a religious leader, he was in so many different, a father, he was in so many different roles that when we study his life, we can gain very, very very powerful advice and an example of how we should be in those given situations. And he went through so much. He had also had disagreements with his wives. He also had, jealousy, and they were human beings. So how did he deal with it? When it comes to anger, I'm just going to inshallah end with this. I think I have to catch a flight. But one of the things that they say, the scholars say, is that at the root of anger is the need for control. That the reason why we tend to get angry is when we feel like we've lost control over something, a situation, a person, whatever. And the problem in this is that we think that we're in control to begin with. If we could realize and we could let go of this illusion of control, and we could realize that all along we're not the ones in control anyway, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one in control. That if we could realize that all the time, we would have a lot less anger when we feel out of control. Because what happens, something didn't work out the way I wanted it. I'm out of control. I'm not in control of this situation anymore. I can't control what this person's doing. I can't. But all along, you weren't in control. It's an illusion. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in control, and that's the concept of la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. There is no change of condition, there is no power, there is no strength, except by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم إنه غفور رحيم. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. السلام عليكم.